Good morning, everyone. It is time for the webinar to begin. So welcome to the controls for accounts payable vendor master teams to prevent fraud in the vendor master file. Now, just really quick, if someone can just type in the question section or the chat section and let me know if you can see my screen. I have an error message waiting for next screen, which I thought that was corrected when I downloaded the GoToWebinar again, but apparently it's not. So if someone can just type in and let me know that they can see my screen, we can go ahead and get started. And if for any reason at any time during this webinar you cannot see my screen, please just download a copy of the handout, the presentation, and follow along from there. Okay, so I do have feedback that you can see my screen. So again, a welcome to the controls for accounts payable vendor master teams to prevent fraud in the vendor master file. Some housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording within 3 days. And actually, as long as everything goes okay, you'll receive a link in an email tomorrow. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. They will be saved for the Q&A section during the last 15 minutes. If I don't get to all of the questions asked during the Q&A session, I will follow up with answers via email, and you may also submit additional questions via email if you think about them after the webinar. Lastly, don't forget to download the handout. It's a PDF of the presentation and an internal controls checklist for the vendor master file. So I am Deborah Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my tagline, putting the AP in happy. As a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, I now work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. I do have a site that is dedicated to the vendor setup and maintenance process for the AP team. I have some free resources and tools, including a blog and a podcast. You'll also see recordings of this webinar and previous webinars, and they're all known for providing actionable steps like you will see in this webinar to help you avoid fraud and compliance fines and penalties. Okay, so let's review the agenda. We will first look at fraud in accounts payable, and then we will review my proprietary vendor process system, Authentication.Validation.Management. And then for each of the agenda items, vendor adds, vendor changes, and vendor record maintenance, I will provide recommendations for what I consider the biggest issue for that section, along with other internal controls and best practices. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with a Q&A section. So let's talk about fraud in accounts payable. So looking at the US first, this US map, and you can check your state and see where you fall in this, but this US map and the stats are taken from the FBI 2019 report of IC3 complaints. Total complaints for the year averages to 1,300 per day. And business email compromise scams were fraudster attempts to trick APT members into believing that they are a CEO or a vendor to change vendor bank details to divert their payments. That resulted in more than $1.7 billion in losses. And this is a global issue. The International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, that is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries, and in October of 2019 they launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag #BECCareful. But the key here really for global fraud is to be proactive in implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices, because no AP vendor team member can be 100% all day, every day to spot these fraudulent scam attempts, especially as many AP team members are still working from home or at least still affected by the pandemic. And of course, cyber criminals know this. Think.Digital Partners have reported that hackers attacked world businesses 22 million times between April 13th and April 19th. Cyber criminals, not surprisingly, are trying to capitalize on this moment. So we know that if fraudulent payments don't go out, it saves your company money, and it also gets your vendor paid faster. But what about you? While you know fraud is evolving, what you may not be aware of is so are the actions that companies are taking against employees that fall for these frauds. Now, in the US, I've only heard of employees being let go, which is bad enough. But in the UK, there are at least 2 incidents where companies are taking stronger actions. The first one, a worker was fined $7,500 because he wired 3 payments totaling $512,000 without first confirming with the client. The second instance, an employee was actually sued because she paid a cyber criminal $138,000. Now, the judge actually did rule in her favor, but in one article, she considers herself unemployable based on that lawsuit. So to help protect your company, your vendor, and you, let's talk through some internal controls and best practices to prevent fraud in the vendor master file and eliminate those fraudulent payments. But first, we're going to do a poll question. So let me launch the first one. Okay, so how many suspicious communications have you experienced since the pandemic? More than 20, 10 to 20, 5 to 10, 1 to 4, or none? And this can be by email, which is considered phishing or BEC, a BEC scam, by phone, because we know they can do deep fakes, and then also by text. And so you can have phishing, vishing, and smishing. Okay, give a couple more seconds, 7 more seconds to vote. Wow, so we do have about 17% that said more than 20, but the majority, 67%, are 1 to 4, and 17% are 5 to 10. So we know that it's an issue, and so this will be a good webinar to address some of those issues. I'm going to go ahead and close that. And okay, and if anyone cannot see my screen, make sure you put something in the questions or in the chat and let me know. And again, if that ever happens during the webinar and I keep going, please make sure you download the handout to follow along. Okay. All right, so that was just external fraud. Now I want to talk about internal fraud. This graphic highlights are from the 2020 ACFE report to the nations, and that's the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And every year they do a similar report about occupational fraud, and it really just never gets better. The fraud triangle says that these three elements are present in internal fraud, which is pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. And three of the top reasons it continues to work is, one, there are less internal controls in that particular organization. Management overrides existing controls, which we know is should not be done. And then also there's just a lack of management review. Municipal and nonprofit organizations see this more often than other industries. And here you can see that they listed the profile of a fraudster, and they show that someone with 6 years or more and that are male are more likely to commit fraud. And that may be true, but there was one that was so big that a documentary was made, and it was actually on Netflix beginning in 2017. It was called All the Queen's Horses, and it's about a city comptroller of Dixon, Illinois. Her name was Rita Crundwell. She stole $53 million of public funds across 20 years, making her the perpetrator of the largest case of municipal fraud in history. Now, they call it All the Queen's Horses because she had horses, and what's funny is that no one thought or saw that she was living above her means. They just thought she had family money. So once you listen to or watch the documentary, you'll see that it is the fraud triangle: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization at its best. Now, it's no longer on Netflix, but yesterday I found it on YouTube to watch for free, and I think it's about 1 hour, 10 minutes long. All right, so let's talk about my proprietary authentication validation management process. And I use it for my clients that still have fully manual or partially manual vendor processes to redesign those processes to avoid both fraud and regulatory fines. So the first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of that vendor documentation. Now, the data source is who is sending, and it can be email or vendor portal. Well, I'm sorry, the data source is who is sending, and then the delivery method can be either email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. So if you have a vendor self-registration portal, you would rely on the delivery method to confirm, since the login requirement really authenticates the data source. So if you are relying on email, fax, or hard copy to receive your vendor supporting documentation, then you would authenticate the data source. And for anyone that is interested, I do have an on-demand recording of a webinar called Protecting Vendor Bank Details when you receive changes via email beyond the phone call, that gives steps to add authentication in the existing vendor changes process when you're receiving them via email. So it talks about authenticating that email. And it even gives an option really to eliminate that confirmation phone call, which I know everyone's kind of leery about. You don't have to, but it gives an option for you to eliminate that. And it's something that you can maybe think about and then take to management. Now, step 2 is validation. and that is where you validate vendor data before it is entered into your ERP. And to help with this, I do have a free download. It's a vendor validation reference list with resource links, which identifies not only the resources to verify a vendor is real and not on any watch list, but it also is divided based on the type of information being validated and on which document you'll find it, such as the invoice or the contract. Now, the third step is management, where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file on a consistent basis. So inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with, checking for duplicate vendors, and then revalidating active vendor data. And I do have another free on-demand webinar, of course I do, and it is called 8 Steps to Clean Your Vendor Master File when you're doing it manually. So if you need a vendor master file cleanup process, please make sure that you register and then watch that webinar. And really, I give away, the secret sauce to what I do when I perform that service for my clients. Okay. Now, lastly, I do have a full e-guide that includes 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and 13 plus best practices, along with other considerations when onboarding and maintaining vendors. So now that you have seen my entire process, let's look at internal controls and best practices in vendor adds, vendor changes, and vendor record maintenance. Okay. And again, for each of these sections, vendor adds, vendor changes, and vendor record maintenance, I will provide recommendations for what I consider the biggest issue, and then look at additional internal controls and best practices. So let's get started with vendor adds. Okay. So the biggest issue I see with adding vendors is duplicate vendors. Now, prior to adding new vendors or the new vendor record, you need to confirm that the vendor does not already have a vendor record on in your vendor master file. Duplicate vendors can be an indicator of fraud, and they can result in duplicate payments. So you want to make sure you or your team members are searching by the legal name, by the tax ID, and by the address. And if you have multiple vendor master files, which many of us have those where we've got multiple accounting systems and ERPs. So if you do have multiple vendor master files, you need to check each to verify the vendor data matches. Typically, multiple vendor master files means that your company has different businesses or different business entities across different accounting systems. And so while you may need to add the vendor to the vendor master file where it does not already exist anyway, it's still a great time to determine if that vendor data needs to be updated in other vendor master files. So that extra check against other vendor master files can be valuable to keeping those records up to date. And then the required document to do that would be the IRS forms W-9 or W-8, depending on whether it's a U.S. vendor or a non-U.S. vendor. And this is if you yourself are a U.S. entity. You may also need the invoice if the remit address is different than the tax address, so you can have the remit address to search by. Okay, so that was duplicate vendors, and that's what I consider the biggest issue. But here are some additional internal controls and best practices. So the first one is to require email addresses. So email addresses are used in the authentication process and needs to be on file. Again, you can watch the on-demand webinar I talked about for banking details for a detailed authentication process. But since they're used for confirmation, you need to require email addresses when you set up the vendor. The next thing is for one-time vendors. You want to pay them by purchasing card or P card to avoid future use and possible tax filing obligations. However, if that's not an option and you do end up adding them to the vendor master file, you want to perform all validations and ensure the vendor is inactivated after payment. And if you don't have that function in your accounting system or ERP to inactivate that vendor, that one-time vendor after payment, then you need to make sure that you notate it so that after the payment is made, someone goes back in and inactivates that vendor. The next one is for assigned third-party payments. So this can be a scenario where your vendor has sold their receivables to an organization, and now your payments to the vendor needs to go to that organization. And that can be the same scenario for garnishments too, by the way, say from the IRS. You do want to onboard that assigned third-party vendor as normal, and then remit the original vendor payments to the new assigned third-party vendor. This ensures that you have full information on both vendors. What you don't want is to put another organization's bank account information or remit address as if it is your vendor's payment information. The next one is one tax ID per vendor record. So if possible in your accounting system or ERP, configure the system to not allow duplicate tax IDs. And again, this helps to avoid duplicate vendors. Now, the next one is to separate customer and employee records from the vendor master file records or vendor records. This will reduce the potential for selecting a customer or an employee record in error, and then it'll also protect against internal fraud since it gives access to change, for example, employee records by a vendor team member versus the actual employee or the payroll team. Now, you can separate them by account groups or vendor types or something else depending on your accounting system or ERP. Now, if any of you on the call or listening to the recording afterwards are working in SAP S/4HANA, where the customer, the vendor, and the employee master files are all part of the business partner, I'd love to hear how that's working for you. Okay. And then the last one that I have is really to send a vendor welcome letter. And you want to send to the vendor with information needed to do business with your company. You want to include where to send invoices, contact information for purchasing, accounts payable, etc., as needed. If you have a centralized invoice submission process, this avoids the inevitable vendor sending an invoice to the internal employee that they actually have the relationship with, and then having that invoice sit on that internal employee's desk until the day before payment is due or the day before year-end close. So those are the vendor changes, and now we're going to move to, or those were the vendor adds, and now we're going to move to vendor changes. But before we do that, here's our second poll question. I would like to know what you currently, I'm going to launch it, what you currently require before updating existing vendor bank details. The bank details on bank or vendor letterhead, a voided check, a phone call to the vendor, 2 or more of the above, or none of the above. Okay, so we've got some coming in. So it looks like the majority, 67%, requires a phone call to the vendor, while we've got 2 or more of the above, so maybe a phone call and the bank details, or maybe on the bank or vendor letterhead, or maybe all of the above, because typically if you ask for the voided check, you're asking for something else as well. So it looks like now that everyone's voted, we've got, or most have voted, we've got 50% phone call, 25% 2 or more of the above, and then 25% voided check. All right, so I'm going to close that. All right, so the next one, we're going to look at vendor changes. And as you probably could have guessed from the poll question, the biggest issue I see in vendor changes is vendor bank changes. And I talked earlier about business email compromise scams in the section on fraud in AP. And so my recommendation is to add in strong controls and create a company branded ACH form and require authentication on that form. So what do I mean by that? Well, my recommendation is that you require on that form either the existing bank details or the last 3 payments, and you want the deposit dates and amounts. I also recommend that you require the full tax ID. And then if you have any unique company element that your vendor would know and that your company, that your vendor would know, you can include that as well. And then optional, but also recommended, I do recommend that you include the remit address. Some accounting systems like PeopleSoft have multiple payment locations tied to separate remit addresses, and having it on the form ensures that you're updating the right location. Also, the vendor ID, and the vendor ID can be a help to know to update for those systems like SAP, where you can have more than one vendor ID for the same tax ID. So just having the vendor ID on the form can help you identify the correct one to update. And again, if your company has any unique element that the vendor knows, you can make that optional instead of required. Now, there are some best practices for the company branded ACH form. The first one is to make sure you change it every year, and then also do not post it on your company website. And the reason that you're doing these 2 things is because you do not want to send it to your vendor until they have authenticated. And again, that process is in the on-demand webinar that I talked about earlier, and I did provide a link to it. And so please register to watch that recording, and it does go into detail about authentication and this branded ACH form. Now, I also do have a toolkit that contains templates for vendor setup forms, desktop procedures, and vendor communications. And it does include a template branded ACH form that has fillable fields for your vendor to populate existing bank details and the full tax ID. And I will have a special discount offer for purchasing at the end of this webinar. And so I have 3 internal controls and best practices for vendor changes. And the first one is related to changes to the vendor legal name. So you want to verify IRS with the IRS 10 match of the new legal name and existing tax ID. If it is not a match, you can request the IRS Form 147C, which is what the IRS issues to the vendor to confirm the changes. And that's really because it can take the IRS time in order to update their system. So in the meantime, you can request that 147C form and keep that on file. And then changes to the vendor tax ID. The tax reporting is linked to the tax ID. So again, you want to verify with the IRS 10 match the new tax ID and the existing legal name. And again, if it's not a match, request the form 147C. But what you want to do is in the vendor master file, you want to inactivate the old vendor record and create a new vendor record with the new tax ID. And that is different from if the vendor only changes their legal name, because if they only changes their legal name, you can update the existing vendor record with the new name. But if they change their tax ID, because tax reporting is linked to the tax ID, you want to inactivate that vendor record instead, and then create a new one with the new tax ID. And then the last one I have here is just to treat inactive vendors the same as new vendors. You want to require the same vendor onboarding documents and validate the vendor data received. And that's because when you inactivated that vendor as part of a consistent process for keeping your vendor master file clean, you inactivated the vendor because they did not have activity, or as part of the process, if some validation was not successful, you reached out to the vendor, they didn't reach back out to you or respond back, so you inactivated the vendor. The whole point is to make sure your vendor master file is always up to date. And so an inactive vendor needs to be updated and it needs to be revalidated. So require the same documentation as a new vendor. And so now let's look at vendor record maintenance in the vendor master file. So for the vendor record maintenance, I have to tell you this section, it was a toss-up, and I almost added the fact that, you know, vendor teams are not doing the cleanup process consistently as the biggest issue. And the only reason I didn't pick it is because it's really not an immediate threat, you know, unless you have an AP automation project and you need a clean vendor list. But the one that is an immediate threat is not implementing compensating controls when you have a segregation of duties issue because your team is too small. And really, having a small team is understandable and expected, but the key is to add compensating controls. And this will give you some a good idea here of what you would need to add. So, you know, implementing these preventative controls when the responsibilities of authorizing transactions, recording transactions, and maintaining custody of assets, when they're not assigned to the separate to separate team members, then you need to implement these preventative controls. So for accounts payable, no one team member should be able to create a vendor record, post an invoice, and then generate a payment. So if you do have that issue, here's at least 4 compensating controls that you can put into place. So the first one is vendor master file review. Now, you need to have a senior level detail review of vendor ads and all changes made. Now, you can also require approval prior to the vendor ad or change again, prior to any activity such as issuing a purchase order or posting an invoice, or just upon initial setup or change. And really, you want to, or that management senior level personnel wants to look for changes in banking or remit addresses that were changed, then changed back quickly. And for each change in your system should maintain an audit log that will tell the date, the time, and the user making the change. And then also, you want to look for and cross-check that the vendor address or vendor banking, if changed, does not match the employee's address or banking. Now, there may be some collaboration with payroll and or IT for this one if you don't already have access to those records. But if you don't already have access, you don't need to get it. You only need a way for that check to be done in the background, and then have them notify you if there is ever a match. So that, again, may mean collaboration with payroll and or IT. And then the next one is a pay cycle review prior to releasing payments. And again, senior level needs to review detailed reports of the payments generated. And then also another good one is reviewing invoices for existing vendors. So ensure that invoice numbering is consistent with historical invoice numbers. Investigate any that have additional letters or numbers, such as an A or a 1, that's added to an otherwise valid invoice number. And then, of course, you want to investigate any invoices out of sequence. And then the last one, if you have any invoices or payments for invoices that are non-PO invoices, verify the invoice and the vendor are valid. And that usually involves looking at, reviewing the backup. And then here are 3 other internal controls and best practices for vendor record maintenance. So the first one is least privilege access. And here you want to limit access to edit the vendor master file outside of the vendor maintenance team. So segregate duties to ensure a team member, again, that has access to create an invoice or generate a payment does not have access to edit the vendor master file. And of course, you want to audit system access regularly to validate continued compliance. And the next one is to mask sensitive personal information. So for all system users, again, outside of the vendor master team, you want to encrypt or mask all except the last 4 or 5 digits of at least the vendor tax ID and the vendor bank account. I have seen it where masking has been done on the routing number as well. Now, if you record the birthday, which is required in some countries, and for W-8s in certain scenarios where an individual does not have an ITIN, you want to make sure that you show the month and day only, not the year. This will allow, this masking will allow all other users to identify the correct vendor. So if they're trying to figure out, which vendor to select, someone outside of the vendor maintenance team, they can use the last 4 or 5 digits to verify that vendor. They don't need the whole number. So it really protects your vendor's personal data while letting them identify the correct vendor. And then audit. So you want to ensure that there is an audit log of all vendor record activity that includes the date, time, field change, and employee. And I think I talked about this earlier too. The other thing that you want to do is you want to audit a percentage of the vendor adds and changes on a recurring basis to validate that processes and controls are being followed. Now, in order to do that, you need to document your process. And I do have a free desktop procedure template as a download on my site. And I'll leave a link to that, or we'll see that when I talk about the vendor team resources. I do have a slide for that. And then I said 3, but I actually have 4. And the last one, of course, is the vendor master file cleanup. And that's where I talked about this as part of my 3-step process, where you're inactivating vendors with no PO, invoice, or payment activity for the last 15, 18, or 24 months. And again, you want to revalidate vendor data and then review duplicates. And my recommendation is to do this monthly, quarterly, or annually, depending on how big your vendor master file is. And again, I do have an on-demand webinar at 8-step process that I linked to in an earlier slide that again explains what I do when I perform that service for my clients. And that brings us to our third poll question, which is, and let me get this launched. When is the last time you inactivated vendors in your accounting system or ERP? This month, last quarter, last year, sometime before 2019, or never? And be honest. I won't tell. Oh, wow. We have some that said this month. Ooh, we're getting higher on the sometime before 2019. So it looks like some folks are due. Okay. So it looks like we have most have voted, and so 20% say this month. So I would clap, but that'll get in the recording. So congrats on that. And then 40% say last quarter, which is still good because last quarter, since this is June, last quarter is still this year. So that's great. And then 40% said sometime before 2019. So we do have some that are due for a vendor master file cleanup. So I'm going to close that. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So I talked about the vendor team resources, and also I have a webinar offer. So before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to go over some of the vendor team resources and the offer that I talked about. So plenty of free resources on the left, all are immediate downloads, and this includes the vendor validation reference list I talked about earlier. Here's the desktop procedure template. And then I also have a W8 expiration date tracking form. And then I've got a ton of on-demand webinars and blogs and also podcasts. And you'll also see here a link to my partners page. Diversified Robotics will build an bot, which is Robotics Process Automation, or RPA. They'll build a bot for you. W9 Manager will manage your incoming W9s. And then, of course, Check an Invoice. They actually have a really good email fraud detection tool. So you'll see my partners there. And then on the right is an offer just for attending this webinar. You'll get 25% off the 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process toolkit. And again, that includes templates for fillable vendor setup forms, desktop procedures with pre-populated examples, and email and letter vendor communications. And then it also includes the e-guide that I talked about earlier. It's included in that toolkit. And then here is how you connect with me. I have my mobile number there, my email. Here's my site, here's my Twitter handle here, and then please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love that. And then I also put a link here to my podcast, Putting the AP in Happy. All right, so little bit over, but now we've come to the Q&A section or session. So we'll get through as many as we can. If your question is not answered, you can reach out to me at info@deborarrichardson.com. And let me see if we have some questions. Okay. So I don't have a lot of questions here, but I do have one I think is a good one. Our process is manual and we still file hard copies received. What are some controls around hard copies? So, well, my first reaction is require electronic versions of the vendor documents sent via email. If that's not an option, then scan them in and shred the originals. And by the way, if you're still receiving hard copies, I'd love to hear what you're doing or what you did when working from home or working remotely as part of the pandemic and the shelter-in-place requirements, because the receiving hard copies or even via regular mail of invoices and vendor supporting documentation was a big issue. Many AP teams had to assign one person to just ignore the shelter-in-place orders and go to the offices to retrieve mail. But in any event, if you're not able to require them be sent electronically, then again, scan them in and shred the originals. And you might want to add a couple of internal controls when you still receive or print hard copies. And that one is to, if you need, is secure print. So if you need to print vendor SPI data or a document that has their SPI data, secure print should be used. And what that does is it eliminates the potential for another team member to walk up to the printer and mistakenly pick up that document in the printer tray, because we know we have that one big printer and then everyone uses it and then you get up from your desk and go over to get it. Well, in between that time, someone else may go and get it. So, or may pick it up, may beat you to the printer and pick it up. So using secure print will not print the documents until you get to the printer and you enter the code. And then another thing I recommend is really just a desk audit. So when you have printed vendor supporting documentation with SPI on it, you go to the printer, you pick it up with secure print, you pick it up and then you bring it back to your desk. And between it getting from your desk to the file cabinet, then it can sit on your desk, and if you get up, if you leave for the day, that information is out there and available for other people to see. So the purpose of the desk audit is to randomly check desks, printers, any common areas to ensure that employees are really always in the mindset of security and protecting sensitive data by discarding it in a locked shredder, or filing it in a locked file cabinet, which again, my recommendation is to make sure that you scan everything in and file it electronically. But no documents with sensitive data should remain on the employee's desk once it has been processed or after they leave for the day. And in addition to vendor sensitive data, you can also include passwords, employee sensitive data, any data that can threaten security. And again, this can be random, maybe once a month. And to make it kind of more palatable for employees, you can also, put some rewards behind it. So, if there was no sensitive data found on employee's desk, those employees would be entered into a raffle, and then you can raffle off things like an hour off, 2 hours off, and you'd be surprised, or maybe not, because maybe you already use it, you know, how motivating it is to provide a free hour or free, you know, 2-hour block of time off of work. Employees seem to really like that. Okay. All right. So next question. All right. Oh, so more about the authentication process in the webinar. So in the webinar that I talked about, where I'm talking about protecting vendor banking details when you see them via email. So there's really 2 steps of an authentication process that I'm talking about. And the first step is really to authenticate the email or the user, the data source coming in. So I actually have a process where you would ask them random questions that have been identified in advance. And so it's actually for the vendor and also for the employee, because you know the employee can be calling in from a cell phone, especially now as folks are still working from home. And so you authenticate the employee just like your bank authenticates you when you call in. They ask you to verify certain elements, so I have that. And then the second piece of the authentication is authenticating the data, and that is what I talked about with the branded company ACH form that in this webinar, where we're adding authenticating data to the form so that when you receive the form, the data matches. That's another level of authentication. So it's really 2 levels of authentication that I include in that webinar. So again, I did provide the link in your handout. So if you'd like to listen to that, feel free. It's on-demand recording, so you can listen to it whenever you want. All right, so I think that is it with the questions. Let me see. All right, so I think we're good with the questions. Again, if you think of any questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to me at info@deborarrrichardson.com. And this webinar is now concluded.